Okay, you guys, so yesterday we ended the hour talking about this picture, I think. And so this was a review over what we've already talked about. This is actually very similar to what we went over yesterday in the homework with the shoe factory. And so your end product, isoleucine, if this becomes, if this accumulates in the cell, so let's say the cell is not using this and it starts to increase in concentration, remember it inhibits the enzyme of that first reaction. So if that enzyme is inhibited, let's look at, I don't think I talked specifically about how it's inhibited. Notice here, this enzyme has an allosteric site. And so if this accumulates in the cell, then that means the cell's not using it. If the cell's not using it, then we don't need to go through this pathway to make it anymore. So as it accumulates, it becomes higher and higher concentration. It binds to that allosteric site on the enzyme, changing the shape of the active site. So notice here, this is the normal shape of the active site. So it changes the shape, turning this enzyme off. If the first reaction in this pathway can't happen, none of the other reactions can happen. And so therefore, isoleucine stops being produced, so it stops accumulating. So you're not going to get any more. So then what happens is if things change in the cell, and the cell now starts using isoleucine, so now it needs it and starts using it, the concentration of isoleucine is going to start going down in the cell. And so what the cell is going to do is even take the isoleucine that's bound to this enzyme and it's going to use it. So when that isoleucine comes off of that enzyme and the cell starts using it, this enzyme goes back to its normal shape, which means that now it can catalyze that first reaction and then the whole pathway can happen, and now the cell, since it's using it, isoleucine, and therefore needs it, starts making it again, and so then it'll keep on making it until eventually the cell doesn't need it as much anymore, so it starts accumulating, and then it'll inhibit the enzyme, and this thing happens over and over and over again. So therefore this reaction or this pathway can be kind of turned on or off by the end product in its concentration in the cell. All right, and so that's where we left off yesterday. And this last slide, there's nothing to write about, but I just want to talk about it in related to things that we've talked about here. So structures within the cell help bring order to metabolic pathways. What are the structures within the cell that we're talking about here? Bring order to organelles. So we have different organelles in the cell. So for instance, the chloroplast. The chloroplast is where photosynthesis occurs, right? So you have photosynthetic enzymes that are used in the process of photosynthesis contained in the chloroplast. This makes the process of photosynthesis more streamlined because you don't have the enzymes for photosynthesis just floating around anywhere in the cell. They're contained in one specific area where that reaction is going to occur. So then you also have the mitochondria, and so the mitochondria is the site of what? Cellular respiration. So in here you have cellular respiration enzymes contained, and therefore streamlines the process of cellular respiration where it occurs. Instead of everything in the cell just kind of randomly floating around, it makes it much more efficient to have them in one area. So that's what that means. Some enzymes act as structural components of membranes. So if this is the cell, so this is the, let's say this is your cell membrane here. All right, and the cell membrane, remember, is a lipid bilayer. And we have proteins embedded in the membrane, and then we have our lipid bilayer, and so on and so forth. So we talked about last chapter that some proteins are involved in getting things through the membrane, into or out of the cell. But then some proteins can actually act as enzymes, and so they can actually be embedded in the membrane. So let's say I hear this enzyme is embedded in the membrane, and it has, this is the active site. So what happens is that this enzyme, well, it's not moving around, it's embedded in the membrane, the substrate, all right, so you have substrates, let's say, in the cell. The substrates randomly move around and hit the active site to this enzyme, and they fit together. Then what can happen is this enzyme can catalyze this reaction and convert this substrate to whatever product. is. And so enzymes can actually be part of the membrane. And so that's what that second bullet is. And so it can be part of the cell membrane. Each of the organelles have membranes, so you can have enzymes embedded in the membrane. Any kind of membrane there can have enzymes. So they're contained in various spots for efficiency and also embedded in the membrane. All enzymes, though, work pretty much the same in that they speed up the reactions in which speed up the conversion of substrates that fit into their active site to products. So they speed that up. How do they speed that up? What do they lower? The energy barrier. That's called the activation energy. So they lower the activation energy in order to speed up reactions. And so no matter where those are, that's what they do. All right? And so this last bullet says some enzymes reside in organelles like this, the enzymes for cellular respiration being located in the mitochondria. And so that's going to bring us right into our next chapter, which is about cellular respiration. So as I said yesterday, we're going to combine 8 and 9, and we'll have a test on both by the end of next week, and we're going to do a lab with 9. Okay, so, and then the sheet that you just picked up today is the review for Chapter 9, and so, so that'll be due the day as the test as well. Okay? Alrighty. So let me switch gears here. So the first part of Chapter 9 gives a brief overview of the relationship between cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration is what? You guys know? What'd you say? Symbiotic is usually with relationships between living things where they're both helped. So let's think of another way to maybe describe that.
I know that photosynthesis builds glucose, and then doesn't cellular respiration break it down and convert it into energy?
Yes, absolutely. And so they actually are completely opposite reactions. So what goes into photosynthesis comes out of cellular respiration, and vice versa. All right, so living cells require energy from outside sources. We are open systems, which means we're not closed systems. We take in energy from outside sources. So plants, where do plants get their energy? From an outside source. The sun. They use the sun to make glucose through photosynthesis, and then they use glucose for energy to make ATP. Where do we get our energy from? Plants or something that ate a plant, right? From our diet, from the food that we eat. So that's what it means by getting energy from outside sources. So animals such as the giant panda obtain energy by eating plants. Other organisms, others feed on organisms that eat plants. Some do both, like we do. So we can, most of us, eat plants and animals, and therefore have a variety of energy sources. It's a giant panda. All right. Energy flows through an ecosystem. So as we just said, starting with sunlight. So we would not have anything to eat and therefore any energy without plants, and plants get their energy from the sun. So the ultimate energy source is from the sun. And then when the plant makes its glucose, we eat the plant, we get glucose, we break the glucose down for energy to make ATP. And some of that energy, though, really is released as heat, so therefore we're increasing the entropy of the universe by that, so that's what that means. So plants do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis generates oxygen in organic molecules, which are used in cellular respiration. The organic molecule we're going to be focusing on is what? What is, when it says glucose? Yeah, so this is glucose for us. All right, and so we're going to talk about glucose being the organic molecule that's used in cellular respiration. Then the cells use the chemical energy stored in the organic molecules, stored in glucose, to regenerate ATP, which powers work. So ATP powers work. Regenerate ATP, what are we meaning there? We're meaning that we're gonna put the phosphate back onto ADP to make ATP. That's the regenerated ATP. So that means we have to have energy to do that. Where does the energy come from? From the energy in glucose. So we have this picture here. So what we're going to do is look, this picture shows you the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And so I'm going to go through each one of these separately here. When we're looking at this is photosynthesis and chloroplast. So when we look here, I'm going to divide this in half. So everything up here on this, the top part is dealing with photosynthesis. So this is what goes in and what goes out. And everything at the bottom half is dealing with cellular respiration. So what goes in and what goes out. And so we have the cycle of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So I'm going to use green to go through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, the plant takes in light energy. Photosynthesis occurs in the plant cells, and in the plant cells, specifically in the chloroplast. And it also takes in two molecules, CO2 and H2O. So where does the plant get H2O? Where's the H2O come from? Yep, it's water. How does it get into the plant? Yeah, this is taken into the roots. So it rains or whatever, now you have water in the ground, you have groundwater, and now this is coming, comes in through the roots. The water does. So what happens is, let me ask you this, do roots do photosynthesis? The roots do not do photosynthesis. Think about where they're at. In the underground, they're not getting any sunlight, no photosynthesis occurring there. And so the roots are to bring in water. It also can bring in some minerals from the ground as well. And that water goes all the way up to the trunk or the stem of the plant through a tunnel system called the xylem to the leaves. The leaves are your main site of photosynthesis. The leaves are getting the majority of the light energy and producing your glucose. Do roots need glucose? Yeah, they do, but they don't do photosynthesis. So guess what? The leaves produce enough glucose, and the glucose travels down the plant through another tunnel system called the phloem, down to the roots. So the roots can have glucose too, because they need energy to grow and so on, just like any other part of the plant. All right, so the water goes in through the roots. Anybody know where the CO2 gets into the plant? So,
doesn't it also go through the leaves?
It goes through the leaves. What about the leaves? That's right. There's little pores that open and close at the bottom side of the leaf called stomata. And when they're open, gas exchange can occur. So gases from the atmosphere can go in and gases can leave. So CO2 goes in, O2 goes out. And so this, so CO2 I'm going to put here, this comes in, this comes from the atmosphere through stomata, which I'm going to put in parentheses are pores on the bottom of the leaf. So that's where they come in. So then what happens is once the water and CO2 are in the leaf, they go into the cells of the leaf and into the chloroplast, where light energy is absorbed, and therefore the reaction of photosynthesis can occur. So at the end of photosynthesis, we end up with organic molecules. Organic molecule, we're talking about C6H12O6. So that's your glucose, is your organic molecule. And then you end up with oxygen. And the oxygen, the organic molecule CO2, is going to be used by the plant. Because remember, the whole purpose of photosynthesis is to make glucose to get energy to make ATP. Because plants need to make ATP just like our cells do. So the glucose was going to stay in the plant here. Does the oxygen stay in the plant? No. So the oxygen, where's it going to go? Yeah, this is going to go back into the atmosphere. And how's it going to get there? Through the stomata. So the oxygen is released into the atmosphere there. So So that's photosynthesis, and that's what plants do. Do plants have mitochondria? Absolutely they do. All right, so plant cells, they make their own glucose, and then they go ahead and break the glucose down in cellular respiration to get energy to make ATP. For us, we don't do this process here. We don't do photosynthesis to get our glucose. We get our glucose from our diet, right? So in this case here, for plants entering cellular respiration, they make their oxygen and their glucose. So I want to talk for a minute here. Animals, for animals to get glucose, this comes from the diet. And then for animals, for oxygen, what do?
Breathe.
All right, yeah, we breathe it in from the atmosphere. Just put atmosphere. So that's how we get it, and plant cells make it. Okay, so the oxygen and the glucose go now to the mitochondria of the plant, where cellular respiration occurs, where we break it down, the glucose, into two molecules that have less energy than glucose. Carbon dioxide and water don't have as much energy. So where does that energy go? That energy is released. So when we break down glucose into CO2 and H2O, that energy, so this is energy coming out of here, that energy is used to make ATP. Why does making ATP require energy? Because remember, we have to put the phosphate back onto ADP to make ATP. So that energy to put that together comes from the breakdown of your glucose, and we make our ATP. ATP powers most cellular work. So this is why we need glucose, to get energy to make ATP so that our cells can do work. When we use ATP to do cellular work, what do we do to it? Break it down. And so to do cellular work, when it says powers most cellular work, we take ATP and we break it down into ADP and a phosphate. This releases energy. This is an exergonic reaction. Not all of that energy is used to do cellular work, so we get some heat energy released, which, remember, these exergonic reactions, the breakdown of glucose is an exergonic reaction releasing energy, and the breakdown of ATP is an exergonic reaction releasing energy. And so both of those, some of that energy is released into the atmosphere as heat, which means that we increase the entropy. All right, by doing these exergonic reactions. And so the purpose of cellular respiration, what would we say the purpose of cellular respiration is?
To power cellular work.
So what's going on with cellular respiration? We're breaking down glucose to release energy to make ATP. So really the purpose of cellular respiration is to get energy to make ATP. All right, then we can use the ATP to do all the cellular work and so on. But the purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP. The purpose of photosynthesis is to make glucose. All right, and so then we have waste products. The CO2 and the water for us are waste products. So what do we do with those? The CO2 and the H2O. Where do we do with these? These guys go back into the atmosphere. So for us, we breathe them out. So when you breathe out, you exhale, you're breathing out in part carbon dioxide, but you also have some water molecules released as well. And that's proven if you ever have created fog on a cold window, all right? That's the water molecules coming out of you, condensing because it's cold, getting closer together, and forming liquid water from the gas, all right? And so that goes back into our atmosphere, and that's what we're breathing out. So therefore, photosynthesis and cellular respiration are opposite reactions. So let me show you the relationship between photosynthesis and cellular respiration of plants, because people always get confused about this. For us, for us it's easy. We don't have photosynthesis, so we eat the glucose. It goes to our cells in the mitochondria. We break it down and make ATP. But for plants, they go through both processes. So if this is a plant cell, this is your chloroplast. All right, so what happens in the chloroplast? Photosynthesis happens there. So photosynthesis happens. What happens in photosynthesis? The end product is glucose, right? So So the plant has made glucose out of photosynthesis. The purpose of getting glucose is to get energy released to make ATP. So therefore, the glucose that's made in the chloroplast during photosynthesis will now travel to the mitochondria. So this is the chloroplast, this is the mitochondria. So the glucose enters into the mitochondria. What's going to happen to the glucose there? It's going to be used in cellular respiration, which means that when it's broken down, what's going to be released? Energy, and the energy is going to be used to make ATP. And so therefore, this plant now has this molecule, ATP, that it can break down when it needs to do cellular work. So plants need this molecule of ATP just like animals, cells. So my question to you now is, do plants do photosynthesis and cellular respiration? They do both of them. Do they do them equally? As the rate of cellular respiration and photosynthesis happen equally or not? And so you have to kind of think about that in the relationship between them. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration, do they happen equally? Talk with a person and come up with an answer. Do you think that you can talk with the people and come up with an answer at your desk if you think that they happen equally?
Do you have any ideas? I would guess not. Because you're probably don't need as much energy as like a human. Yeah. Because there's a lot of choices for getting glucose. We only get it in the and they get it from sunlight and usually sunlight. So like if they really get it, they're going to be break it down.
They would reduce glucose more quickly.
They're really fast. Like,
I was just curious.
and I don't have an actual.
I was curious because they're always.
And they're really fast, like milliseconds.
Right,
Like
because it's breathing out carbon dioxide.
I have a statistic for you that gives you some idea. I'm not good with numbers, so I don't remember statistics, like, you know, but I wrote it down. When did I write it down?
Because when you're breathing out, every time you inhale or exhale, you're breathing in oxygen, and when you're exhaling carbon dioxide, that our reactions happening that fast. I knew how many. Yeah, it's like that. So I'm assuming you guys how many reactions.
I like going into child's pose and taking a nap.
You guys, Steve and I, somebody asked about how long does this happen. So for cellular respiration, like making ATP, I have a statistic about a muscle cell working. On average, one muscle cell uses about 10 million ATPs. They use and regenerate, which means they break them down and make 10 million of them per second per cell. So this is really fast. All right, this is really fast. All right, and we did a lab with enzyme, and I have a second stat. Enzymes on average bind and convert substrates into products. They actually act on average about 1,000 substrates per second. So they're really fast. All right. Really fast. So all this is occurring in milliseconds.
It's okay. Wow.
All right. Who wants to share about what you think about the rate of photosynthesis versus cellular respiration in class? Today, in plants. Not in class. All right, in plants. So do they happen equally? Does one happen more than the other, do you think? What do you think?
We were talking and we thought that it would be the photosynthesis would occur more than cellular respiration because plants are able to get it from sunlight and they have a lot of leaves that are able to capture that sunlight. So I would guess that the energy they could get from sun is just easier to obtain than you eating a plant or you eating another animal.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So they just have to absorb it. Absolutely. And she's right that photosynthesis does occur more often than cellular respiration. And so there's a couple of other reasons or our thought processes to come up with that photosynthesis occurs more than cellular respiration. Anybody have something to add to that?
Well, plants need glucose for more than just cellular respiration, so they might make an excess of glucose to like make structure and like build stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So when photosynthesis, when the glucose is, some of it can be used right away, but remember that we talked about that some of the glucose the plants can store in long chains. What's the storage, glucose storage molecule?
Cellular.
Starch. So storage is starch. Cellulose, another use for glucose, is cellulose where they can take glucose and hook them together a little bit differently. And cellulose, remember, is the component of the cell walls, all right, for structure and so on. So absolutely. So, and think about this. If plants didn't store glucose in some way, if they used up all their glucose, would we ever be able to get any glucose from plants?
No.
No, okay, so then it wouldn't be helpful to eat them and so on. So they do store some glucose in, and so then when we eat it, we get some energy sources. And then think of also the other molecule that's released, oxygen. If plants did photosynthesis in equal rates as cellular respiration, would plants ever release oxygen into the air? No. What would happen to us?
We'd die.
Yes, we would die, right? We need the plants to keep on doing photosynthesis to release oxygen. So we need it for food source, energy source, and we also need it for oxygen. So therefore, this part of this cycle occurs way more often than this part, all right? And that's where we get the excess glucose and O2. All right, very good. So then let's go on here. So the first section there, so that's the overview. And this chapter is about cellular respiration. Chapter 10, which we're going to do on the next test. I like to separate photosynthesis and cellular respiration because they're so similar that on a test people get confused between the two of them. All right, so this section here gives you some background information that we need to know about cellular respiration. So the title says catabolic pathways yield energy. Catabolic pathway is an exergonic reaction. It's going to release energy by oxidizing organic fuel. So we're going to talk about what this word oxidizing means. For those of you who have had chemistry, we're going to do a little review of what a redox reaction is. Does that sound familiar to anybody? If it doesn't, then don't worry about it. I'm going to teach you what you need to know. And it says oxidizing organic fuel. What's the fuel, do you think, in cellular respiration? Glucose is the fuel. That's what we're going to break down to get energy. And that's what you do with fuel. You break it down to get energy. So the organic fuel is going to be glucose. So we'll look at some processes that you need to know about cellular respiration here. So first thing is production of ATP. So we know that the breakdown of organic molecules like glucose is exergonic. Hopefully we know that by now. Fermentation, we'll talk towards the end of the chapter, is a partial degradation of sugars that occur without oxygen. Now when we break down glucose, it's exergonic, but remember that, let's go back to this picture here, that to break down glucose, you need oxygen present. So when we break down glucose, it has to have, in order to get the maximum amount of energy, to get your maximum amount of ATP from each glucose molecule, oxygen needs to be present. And so if there's no oxygen present, we can break down glucose for a little bit and get a little bit of energy to make ATP, but it's not enough ATP made to keep your cells alive, which is why if we don't stop breathing and don't get oxygen, we'll die very quickly, all right? And so you need the oxygen there to break down the glucose enough to get the maximum amount of ATP to keep your cells alive. And that'll make more sense as we go along here. All right. So cellular respiration consumes oxygen in organic molecules. Again, the organic molecule is glucose, and yields at the end the ATP. Now it also yields CO2 and water. They're not putting CO2 in water because those are really waste products, but yet they come out of cellular respiration. The big thing for cellular respiration is getting ATP. Now, we're going to focus on glucose, but although other carbohydrates, fats, and proteins all can be consumed as fuel, but we're going to trace and go through cellular respiration with glucose as our fuel. And so we'll talk at the very end of the chapter that yes, in this process of cellular respiration with glucose and oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and energy to make ATP, and some energy released as heat, increasing the entropy of the universe. But right here, this glucose, we're going to follow it as glucose, but we'll see at the end of the chapter that also fats can enter cellular respiration. We can get some energy from fats and make some ATP from fats. Same thing with proteins. Same thing from other sugars besides glucose. Glucose is not the only molecule that can go through this process, although we're using it as the example, and most textbooks do. All right, so did I go too fast?
Yeah.
So this process of cellular respiration is exergonic, and it's also an example of an oxidation reduction reaction. So otherwise known as redox reactions, oxidation and reduction. All right, so I'm going to go through what this is. The transfer of electrons during chemical reactions releases energy stored in organic molecules. This released energy is ultimately going to be used to make ATP in cellular respiration. So basically, the transfer of electrons, releases energy. So one molecule gives electrons and the other one accepts electrons. That's the transfer. Whoops. Chemical reactions that transfer electrons between reactants are called oxidation reduction reactions or redox reactions. I just want to see how many people does this sound familiar to at all? Nobody? Okay. I didn't know. So regular chem, they don't do this, right? Okay. I think you might teach us AP, huh? Okay. Honors chem, they did it? No. Okay. All right. In oxidation, a substance loses electrons or is oxidized. In reduction, a substance gains electrons or is reduced. So what we're going to look at here is, so electrons have a negative charge, right? So when it says something is reduced, it gains electrons, because what happens is if you gain electrons, you gain negativity, and so that's a reduction in charge, so the amount of positive charge is reduced. A way to remember this, there's a saying here, oil rig, and so this helps us to remember what oxidation and reduction means. What do you think it means? Like, what do you think these letters stand for?
Oxidation is loss.
Oxidation is losing electrons, and reduction is gaining electrons. All right, so that's an easy way for help you to remember what that means when something is being reduced or oxidized. And so if we look at this generic reaction here, so we have reactants X and Y, and we have, notice here, an electron attached to X. And so the definition of a redox reaction is the transfer of electrons between reactants. So the X, molecule X, is going to give an electron to molecule Y. So X, from the beginning of the reaction to the end of the reaction, has lost an electron because it gave the electron to Y. So therefore, X, we would say, has become oxidized, and that the process is oxidation because it has lost an electron. Oxidation is losing. Versus the Y gained the electron from the X, and so therefore Y is reduced because reduction is gaining, so it gains that electron. And so that is a generic example of what a redox reaction is. And so one loses, one gains. And so therefore in a redox reaction, you have always something becoming oxidized and always something becoming reduced. So let's relate this to a real reaction. These two bullets here, go ahead and cross off. You don't need to know for this class reducing and oxidizing agent. And that's a really good thing that the AP people don't want you to know that because people always used to get confused over this. Cross that out. So we're going to relate this. It says here, some redox reactions, though, do not actually transfer electrons from one molecule to the next, but change the electron sharing in covalent bonds. Covalent bonds, electron sharing in covalent bonds. You guys remember the two types of covalent bonds that we talked about earlier this year? Yeah, the two types were polar and non-polar, right? How were they different? Raise your hand if you can tell me how they were different. Non-polar versus covalent bonds versus polar covalent bonds. How are they different?
Polar bonds would have overall partial charge, without the non-polar would have no net charge.
That's right. So like water was a polar molecule. It had the oxygen is slightly negative, the partial negative charge, and the hydrogen has the partial positive charge. Why is that though? What is it about the sharing of the electrons?
They're shared unequally between the different molecules.
That's right. So this is polar was unequal sharing of electrons. And so that resulted in those partial charges that Sage was just talking about. This nonpolar was equal sharing of electrons, right? So let's so what happens is sometimes, like in our last, we'll go back over here. Oh, I'm all screwed up here. Well, I want to go back to the X and the Y thing. When it does this, I don't know which. I have to go back one more. This one. All right. So the X and the Y here. This was an actual transfer where this gave an electron to this. All right. And so therefore, the electron literally was transferred between molecules. And the next example we're going to look at is the electrons aren't actually they're actually not transferred, but we change how the electrons are shared. So we're going to look at methane and oxygen here. So methane is a gas that we can burn. And so here we have methane. Methane is CH4, and it's going to react with the oxygen O2. So down below here, it shows you how these molecules, the atoms of those molecules are bonded together. So if you remember that the line between the C and the H represents a covalent bond, which is sharing electrons. And so then they're sharing electrons. The carbon is sharing one electron with hydrogen. Hydrogen is sharing one electron with carbon. So we have a pair of shared electrons. Notice that the electrons, they drew the electron pair that they're sharing right in the middle of where the carbon is and the hydrogen is. What do you think the publisher is trying to convey by putting those electrons in the middle there?
It's like equal sharing.
Yes, they're trying to show that this is equal sharing. So this is a nonpolar, these are nonpolar bonds here, which, as we said, are equal sharing. So these guys are sharing the electrons equally, which means that they have the same electronegativity. One doesn't draw the electrons towards itself more than another. And so they equally share. So the same thing is going on with the O2. O2 is two oxygens bonded together. That's a double bond, so therefore, there's two pairs of electrons shared between them. Since they're both oxygen, they both have equal electronegativity. One doesn't draw electrons more towards it than the other. And so your two pairs of electrons are right in the middle. So this is also a nonpolar bond in terms of sharing electrons. All right, so that's what we have at the beginning of this reaction. So then let's look at the two molecules we have at the end. We have carbon dioxide and we have water. So here's your carbon dioxide and water. So let's look at what happens. So the carbon and carbon dioxide was once part of what molecule at the beginning of the reaction? It had to be part of methane. Methane's the only thing that has carbon in it. So this carbon here is going to become this carbon here. All right? So part of the reaction is taking off the hydrogens that were once part of methane and putting on the oxygens and so on. So let's look at what happens to the carbon. So now this carbon that was once here is now the carbon here. Now look at here. It's bonding with two oxygen molecules. What's happening with the sharing of electrons? Is it equal anymore?
No.
No. So now we have unequal sharing of electrons. Electron sharing. And so this carbon has gone from having the electrons spinning around it a little bit more often because it was equal sharing between the two to less often here because the oxygen is a more electronegative atom, is going to draw the electrons towards itself. So these electrons are spending more time around oxygen than they are carbon. And so since it's two oxygens, it's happening on both sides here. And so we would say, notice here, it says that methane, the carbon in methane becomes oxidized. Well, what did oxidize mean? Oxidize is losing electrons. Now, did the carbon actually lose electrons from here to here? No. But the way that they share the electrons has changed. So the electrons spend less time around the carbon, and therefore we'd say that carbon is oxidized. And that's where this, going back one slide here, this bullet here where some redox reactions do not transfer electrons but change the electron sharing in covalent bonds, that's what's happened here. We've changed the way that the electrons are shared. So now when we look at oxygen, the oxygen that was once part of this O2 molecule is now over here with the water. And so what happens is that this oxygen has become reduced, meaning reduction is gaining electrons. And so how does it gain electrons? Let's look at here. In the water molecule, the oxygen is bonded now with two hydrogens instead of another oxygen. And so therefore, oxygen is a more electronegative electronegative atom. And so therefore, it draws the electrons towards itself. So then this is also unequal sharing. So therefore, the oxygen has gone from having to share equally between the other oxygen atoms to unequally, and the oxygen gets the electrons more often, and so therefore it has become reduced, even though the electrons haven't been transferred. All right, and so this is still considered a redox reaction, even though they're literally not transferring electrons. The sharing pattern has changed. So this is very similar to cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, remember, is glucose plus oxygen, gives you carbon dioxide and water, and it releases energy. And so this is a typical combustion reaction where we're going to burn a fuel. And in cellular respiration, the only thing different is the fuel source. Instead of methane, what's going to be in the spot? Glucose. Glucose is going to be there. All right, so when we look at the next slide here, during cellular respiration, the fuel, such as glucose, this is such as glucose because remember there are other things that can go into cellular respiration, is oxidized and oxygen is reduced. So this was the spot where methane was, all right, and then we have our oxygen, carbon dioxide, and water. So glucose is going to become oxidized. So what does this mean? It's going to lose electrons. So the process of cellular respiration is stripping and taking electrons off of glucose. And then the oxygen is going to become reduced just like the oxygen was in the methane example. So the oxygen is going to gain electrons. And then we get energy released, and that energy, some of that can be used to make ATP. So cellular respiration is a redox reaction. So let's look at then stripping electrons from glucose. So in cellular respiration, glucose and other organic molecules are broken down in a series of steps. It's helpful to do lots of different steps. It's a pathway. Remember I said that arrow in cellular respiration, there's many different steps in between there. So what that does is allow to release a little bit of energy at a time. And so when we strip or oxidize glucose, or take away the electrons from glucose, they are transferred to a molecule called NAD+. The plus, what does that imply?
It's positively charged.
It's positively charged, and how does one become positively charged? What must have happened to it?
Lost in luck.
It lost an electron. All right, so NAD+, this is a coenzyme, which means that it helps an enzyme to work. And so, so I'm going to introduce NAD+ to you, and then as through the rest of the chapter, NAD+ is very important. All right, so what this is it's an electron acceptor. So as an electron acceptor, NAD+ functions as an oxidizing agent during cellular respiration. Like I told you before, we don't need to really understand what oxidizing agent means. What we need to know about NAD+ is that it's an electron acceptor. If NAD+ is an electron acceptor and accepts electrons, is NAD+ going to be oxidized or reduced when it accepts electrons?
Reduced.
Yeah, reduction is gaining. So therefore, when it gains or accepts electrons, it's going to become reduced. And when it becomes reduced, it converts into what we call NADH. Notice that it says each NADH, the reduced form of NAD+. So what does that mean? The reduced form means it has accepted electrons. Represents stored energy that's tapped into to make ATP or to synthesize ATP later. So basically, we're going to take electrons off of glucose, and this molecule is going to accept the electrons, and eventually those electrons are going to be used to make ATP. So let's look at this reaction here. So this is NAD+ right here. So NAD+, and this is the whole structure of the molecule. What's really important in this is this part of the molecule, which is why it kind of has a little white box there. That's the important part. Notice here, mine is colored in blue, yours is not, so I'm going to circle that and highlight the plus. That's important. Nitrogen is positively charged. As Sage said, how does something become positively charged? It has lost an electron. So this is lost an electron. Notice here, it says oxidized form. Oxidized is losing an electron, is lost an electron. All right, so there's NAD+. So then what happens is NAD+ is going to accept electrons. Where do those electrons come from? They come from the hydrogen in food. So what's our food molecule? We're talking C6H12O6. So this is glucose. So we're talking two hydrogens that were part of the food. And so the glucose. So two hydrogens are stripped from the glucose. So let's review what a hydrogen atom is. A hydrogen atom is one proton in the nucleus, and spinning around it, it has one electron, right? That's what a hydrogen atom is. And so over here, we have two hydrogens, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that. And another hydrogen, we have two hydrogen atoms. So what happens here is when you have two hydrogen atoms, you really have two protons and two electrons, right? Notice here it says the two hydrogens we can think of as two electrons and two H pluses. An H plus is really a hydrogen atom that has lost its electron, which is really a proton. So two electrons and two protons are another way to think of hydrogen atoms. And so that comes from our food. So then these two come into contact with one another, and we have dehydrogenase. Well, ACE means it's an enzyme. So this enzyme speeds this reaction up. And what you get is at the end, NADH. So let's talk about how it's NADH now. And notice it says reduced form. Look at this part right here. What happened to the positive charge? It's not there. So you know what happened? What's going to make it not positive anymore? Gains an electron. Where does that electron come from? One of the two hydrogens. So I'm going to circle in another color this electron, and I'm going to draw it over here. And this electron went to neutralize that nitrogen. And that's why this is reduced. It has gained, reduction is gaining. It has gained an electron from the hydrogen. So now this hydrogen that lost its electron is now H plus, we call it, right? What's another difference between this one and this one? Look at here. This has this carbon atom at the top here has one hydrogen. Look at here. Has a second hydrogen now. Where did that second hydrogen come from? It's one of the two hydrogens that was once part of glucose. So this little guy right here is now that hydrogen. So what do we have left over? So now this is NADH. So notice the name. No longer has the plus. That's because the electron neutralized it. And it's not NAD because it gained an extra hydrogen. So now it's NADH. And so therefore we have, what do we have left over? An H plus. And this little guy here is the left. That's why it says plus H plus. It's because to make that, you have left over a hydrogen ion. Does that make sense? Okay. So therefore, NADH, this is an electron carrier. So NADH carries how many electrons that were once part of glucose? We're taking electrons out of glucose. So we took two hydrogens off of glucose. Those two hydrogens donated an electron here, and one of the hydrogens is there. So how many electrons from glucose are now in this NADH molecule? That's right, 2. And so NADH carries 2 electrons that were once part of glucose. The 2 electrons, one went to neutralize the nitrogen, and one is in the extra hydrogen.